So assuming you've watched the first video, oh, here we go. Assuming you've watched the first video, this video is now going to look at working with patterns in a bit more depth. So at the end of the last video, we saw that we could copy a pattern and then paste it into a new pattern. We have 4 banks, A, B, C and D, and 8 patterns in each bank, giving us a total of 32 patterns. Okay. I've also created a third pattern, which is a little bit of a breakdown, which works with the, where is it? Kick drum, and the first kick drum. Okay, it's not the most inspiring pattern in the world, but it doesn't really matter. The second pattern, I'm going to add some sort of ride cymbals. Just so we've got a bit of differentiation between the 2 patterns. And now I want to get these patterns down into my sequence, into my song. And there's 2 ways that we can do it. The most common way that people tend to use is to use the pattern editor here and to actually put them down on the sequencer. So this is what you do. Down on your Redum, you need to turn this button on. And when you do, it creates the pattern lane. And you can see that a track is created here, pattern select. And very simply, you now take your pencil and you draw in a box. Let's just zoom in a bit. So let's say we want 8 bars. And you can see that that has now selected pattern A1 for us. Now this is really important. Don't draw in up here, because it won't make one. Okay, that's for notes, and we'll come to that a little bit later on. For drawing patterns, you must do it on the pattern select lane. And a quick tip, if you press Command, if you're on a Mac, if you press Command, it will go between pencil and arrow. Okay, so I want to now actually change the pattern. I want to start with A1. So I've chosen my arrow, and I click on the box, and I can choose A1. Oh, sorry, that is what it's set to. I'm being stupid. I'm going to now duplicate this pattern. I'm going to work with the arrow. I'm going to click and drag. So to click and drag, it's click, hold out, and drag it along. And this one, I'm going to put on A2. Okay. Now let's imagine that actually I wanted 1 bar of that breakdown right at the very end. I can just shrink my pattern where I want it to go. This is so much different to reason 3. Oh, in fact, reasons 1 to 3. Which were much more complicated in their patterns. This really is much more visual and easier to work with. So this time we're going to go back to my pencil, draw in a square there. It's a little bit small, so I'm going to zoom in. And this pattern I'm now going to choose as pattern A3. So bank A, pattern 3. Okay. Now when I press stop to start us from the beginning, you can see that Reason has now drawn a green box around our patterns. And as soon as you see the green box, you know that your patterns are waiting to be, they've been put down onto the track. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so if we play this back, we should see the pattern change. So pretty easy to do, pretty easy to arrange our patterns. And if you wanted some silence, for example, right at the very end, just drag it down. Just leave nothing there. In the old days in Reason, you had to draw in a blank pattern. You had to, for example, I always used to use D8. And you always had to remember that it was empty. But nowadays, all you do is just leave a space. Okay, so that is how you get your patterns down onto the pattern select. The next stage, if you've got some patterns down, you may want to start adding some notes by hand, and you don't want them to be on the pattern, as it were. So this is where we use our lanes. Okay, so let's, for example, find a sound that we want to work with. Not use this one yet, the little rim shot. record. Okay, you get the idea. Maybe not the most in-time notes, but we can double click and we can see our notes and we can see it's part of this rim section. Okay, I'm not going to look at quantizing at the moment because we'll come back to that at a later date. Click on this button to come back to our window, and what we can do now is should be able to create a new note lane, and we can create as many as we want. So let's make sure you label things. So that's our rims, and then on lane 2 we might, for example, draw in some extra kicks. So hit record. That's utter rubbish. I'm just going to try that again. I'm not getting my rhythms all out today. I apologise. Hopefully you get the idea. So what you're able to do is start to build up a collection of sounds on top of your patterns. Now the next question is, well, I like working with patterns, but I want to actually change my notes around. I don't want to work with patterns. I want to see these patterns down on the screen. How do I go about that? Okay, well, let's have a look. So let's choose an empty pattern lane, and we'll go to the pattern that we want, and we're going to right click on our Redum, and we're going to tell it to copy pattern to track. And when we click this, boom, it puts all our notes down onto our track. And you can see it's recorded all the velocities, it's recorded everything that we want, where we want. It will also place where we want this track depending on where your locators are. So if we do that again and we drag our locators out to, say, bar 17, and we do exactly the same thing, then it's done it for 16 bars. Now, this is the key. If you do copy pattern to track, that's great, but you must then turn patterns off, because if you don't, this is what happens. You get phasing, and basically the notes are playing and the patterns are playing. If we turn pattern select off, still got phasing. So what we need to do is actually turn pattern off. Okay, and then you've got your notes. And what I used to do is just copy it down to different lanes and then spend a bit of time just organising them. So I would, for example, if I wanted just my kicks, let's just zoom out a minute. If I wanted just my kicks, then I would delete everything else. If we come out of there, you can see that we're just left with the kicks, and I can just call those kicks, and so on and so forth. Why do that? Well, if you spend a bit of time doing it, what it means is that you can really get into go to town with arranging your drum patterns, and you've got a much more visual idea of what's going on, whereas the patterns don't really tell you what's in the pattern. So, for example, I might not want kicks for the first 8 bars, and I could just mute them out, and I would be left with everything else. If we remove these, and if on this pattern we actually remove those kicks, you can see that we can really get into grips with arranging our drums. Okay, 10 minutes are up. Next lesson, we're going to look at wiring and all the fun, funky things that you can do with the Redrum.